The Nintendo Switch 2 dev kit situation continues to be super weird, because if you're an indie developer, odds are still super high that you don't have your hands on a Switch 2 dev kit, and Nintendo's bizarre reasoning for this may have just been revealed. The truth is that you need to hop on Mario's long thick green pipe if you okay, maybe not, but in all seriousness though, having a Switch 2 dev kit right now still feels like an exclusive club that lots of indie developers are not in. And by the way, the Switch 2 has been out for 4 months now, so what good reason could Nintendo have here? Well, we'll talk about that today, and the craziest part is that I might agree with Nintendo here. I know it sounds insane, so let's dive deep and figure out what exactly is going on here. But first, what's going on, guys? Cheers. So this story comes from Cowcat Games over on Twitter. They posted yesterday that 4 months after launch, Switch 2 dev kits are still unavailable for 95% of us indie devs. Thank God for backwards compatibility. The message is clear: Nintendo exclusively wants AAAs and the highest popular indies on their shiny new system. Thank God for Steam giving those popular indies discoverability in the first place, because everyone starts small, and they did too. Now, for those of you who don't know Cowcat Games, I didn't either, but they are apparently a small indie developer responsible for a game called Brock the Investigator, as well as Brock the Brawl Bar, which I am not super familiar with these titles specifically. But if we take a look at Brock the Investigator's Steam page, you can see that this game has overwhelmingly positive reviews. So okay, that's good to know. This is a genuinely good game that people who buy end up enjoying, so that's really nice to see. And you might think that, okay, well, if a game has overwhelmingly positive reviews here, you might expect this game to do well on a console like the Switch or the Switch 2. And we'll talk about why they don't have a dev kit in just a second, but they actually went on to say that they are fine releasing their game on Switch 1. It's just a shame because, one, reduced number of enemies on the screen in some Brawl Bar challenges and creator mode, Switch 2 owners will be as limited because it's backwards compatible. They have to use the Switch 1 game basically. The eShop seems to really favor Switch 2 titles compared to competition, which mixes titles from both previous and current generation, so lost visibility, which on the contrary is maximized for the few who gets to release on it. That's fair. If you own a Switch 2, I believe you can actually sort in the eShop by Switch 2 games only, right? So you don't see any of the stuff that's on Switch 1, only Switch 2. And if people tend to do that for their new console, they're not going to see indie games like Brock the Brawl Bar. Okay, and finally, if not for backwards compatibility being pretty good, this situation would be really dire. And even then, there are some exceptions, like the dev of Path of Titans, which game doesn't run correctly on Switch 2 and basically can't do anything about it. As they've explained on this thread, no dev kit and no message to current players allowed. So what they're saying here is that for Brock the Brawl Bar, this isn't a huge deal because, I mean, you know, it's as much as they would like to be on Switch 2, at least the backwards compatibility is good, but other indie developers are not so lucky. They have a broken game on Switch 2. It only works correctly on the Switch 1, which means they miss out on the install base of the Switch 2. So what is the new development here? Because if you guys have been watching the channel for a while, we actually covered the dev kit situation a few weeks ago, and we actually have a new update from Kiwi Talks. Now, if you guys don't know who Kiwi Talks is, we've actually referenced some of their posts here on the channel before. Apparently I wasn't following Kiwi Talks, so I apologize for that. I have rectified the situation, but Kiwi Talks is actually a game developer interviewer. I will link their channel in the description below, but as you can see here, they have interviewed some really high profile game developers over the years. And not only can you listen to these interviews over on YouTube, but it's also available on Spotify as well as a podcast. So while I don't think that Kiwi Talks is a quote unquote industry insider himself, he does seem to be pretty well connected in certain circles and is able to talk to these developers directly. And this is the update that Kiwi Talks posted on Twitter just yesterday. They said the reason Nintendo is not providing dev kits is they are trying to lessen the shovelware problem Switch 1 has. They would rather indie devs just use Switch 1 dev kits in most cases. They don't want the Switch 2 eShop overrun with shovelware slop, and it is also to ensure the big third parties get seen more on the eShop and don't get buried by shovelware. 2026 is the year of big third parties on Switch 2, and Nintendo wants to ensure they succeed as it creates a positive feedback loop for Nintendo, so expect the dev kit issue to continue for a good while. This is a deliberate tactic by Nintendo. So Kiwi Talks is pretty decisive here in their wording. They're saying, hey, I'm not speculating here, this is straight up exactly what Nintendo's plan was. There's no guessing, there's no allegedly, this is just straight up, it is what it is. Nintendo is doing this on purpose, and honestly, I can kind of understand why they would want to do this. If you guys have seen any of my videos in the past, you'll know that I made a video a while ago covering the AI slop problem, not only on the Nintendo eShop, but it has also spread to other digital marketplaces, especially over there on the PlayStation Network. There is tons of AI slop games that you see on these digital marketplaces, even on Steam and things like that. And realistically, the eShop and other digital marketplaces being overrun with these types of AI slop garbage games is a worse customer experience, right? If you just bought a Switch 2 and you go to the eShop and you're genuinely looking for a solid game to play, and all you see is pages and pages of, you know, anime cat block breaker 3000, you know, Diablo edition or something stupid, right? And it's normally $10, but now it's 99 cents, right? For a limited time only, even though that limited time is in perpetuity, right? These are the types of slop shovelware garbage games that Nintendo doesn't want to flood the Switch 2 version of the eShop. Now, as mentioned by Brock of the Brawl Bar, their game is clearly not one of those, you know, AI slop garbage games. In fact, I quite like the art style of this game. It does look like it is it does look like it kind of adopts more of a furry art style, and I know that's not going to be for everybody. I personally, you know, whatever you're into, I really don't care, but some of the art style here is quite nice, right? I actually kind of like it. So, you know, with a game that is overwhelmingly positive like Brock the Investigator and Brock the Brawl Bar, it is unfortunate that indie developers like this aren't able to get their game on the Switch 2, because it seems like they are probably a solid game and don't fall into the sort of camp of those AI slop shovelware games, right? So decent indie developers, and you know, I haven't played this game, right? So I can't really vouch for its quality or anything like that. I've not played it. I don't actually know. Okay, so maybe this game is not very good. If you've played it, you can let me know in the comment section below. I'm not sponsored by these guys or promoting it or whatever, but my point is, it seems like solid indie developers are kind of getting caught in the crossfire here, and they're unable to put their game on the new console, even though it's a solid game from what I can tell. Now, again, as a response to this, Cowcat Games did actually post again saying that they don't really love the idea of the reasoning being that the Switch 2 and Nintendo don't want all this new shovelware from smaller indie games, again citing the fact that their game has overwhelmingly positive reviews, which is totally fine. And I think this is a good point to make here, where, like, again, this is someone that's caught in the crossfires here, right? Where for them this may not be an applicable argument, but it is definitely an applicable argument for many games that are on the Switch 1 eShop. Now, as a response to the chatter that this all started to cause, Kiwi Talks did actually reiterate, saying that following up from my previous post, since heaps of people on here have dyslexia or something, you can separate Switch 1 software from Switch 2 software in multiple places on the eShop. In the search function, current offers, and charts, you can also separate them on the eShop website as well. Nintendo will continue to make improvements to the eShop as time goes on to streamline it more. And I think this is, like, all of this does fall in line with what Nintendo actually said back during the Gamescom situation where this first came to light. But one of the problems here is actually something that was posted yesterday over on Nintendo Life, and many others have also covered this as well. But more Switch games got their Switch 2 compatibility fixes with the latest update for the Switch 2, bumping the firmware version up to 20.5. Once you've updated to this particular version, issues related to certain Switch games running on Switch 2 should be resolved. This also notably includes Warframe and follows the game's developer showcasing the first gameplay of a dedicated Switch 2 build earlier this week. Here are the games that are now fully functioning on Nintendo's new hybrid system via Nintendo Everything. We have Demo Reborn, Library of Runia, Powerful Pro Baseball 2024-2025, Ultra Age, and Warframe. Along with this, Nintendo has also identified problems with Jelly Troops, which is unsupported. The game progression issues are a thing. Kingdoms of Amalur Re-Reckoning has graphical issues. Mugen Souls has item display issues, Subway Simulator 2025 City Train has animation issues, and Transistor has game issues when docking and undocking the system. Now I think these are just the latest games to have identified issues. I believe that there are more identified issues with other games as well, and so I think this kind of goes to show that Cowcat Games does kind of have a point here where Nintendo is still finding these Switch 1 games that have backwards compatibility issues, and while there aren't that many games that have these backwards compatibility issues, it does suck to be one of those developers who can't get a Switch 2 dev kit, and you kind of are just like hoping that Nintendo can fix the game for you at some point. Hopefully they get to it soon, I guess. I don't really know. And the thing about small indie game developers is that like sometimes these are teams of one person, or you've got like, you know, one main developer and some freelancers that are hired to work on certain things, right? Like these are people that are like trying to put food on the table, and like it's not this big studio, it's just a couple of people, right? So like it would be really nice if they got their hands on Switch 2 dev kits and they were able to have more control over how well their game actually performs on the Switch 2 and not be at the mercy of Nintendo. But when it really comes down to it, when I think about both sides of this situation, when I think about the arguments from Cowcat Games and I think about Nintendo's argument that is being sort of reiterated here by Kiwi Talks, I think I partially agree with Nintendo here. I do think that having an eShop filled with AI slop and just indie garbage is not good. It's not a good customer experience, right? And at the end of the day, I think that is the number one thing that Nintendo is thinking about here. Like, what do we want the customers to experience when they boot up the eShop on the Switch 2 and they filter it by Switch 2 only games, right? They want that to be a better experience than it was for Switch 1 users. I can totally see the argument there, but on the flip side, I'm trying to think, like, wouldn't it just be better to have a more strict system for putting your game on the Nintendo eShop, right? Like, I mean, some of these games are so obviously garbage that it wouldn't take that much digging to like weed these things out, right? So I don't understand what the issue is here when it comes to like actually resolving the issue, right? The issue is AI slop garbage on the eShop. Okay, that's the real problem here, right? If that problem did not exist, then you could easily argue that all the indie developers would be able to get their hands on a dev kit, right? Like, why wouldn't that be the case? Wouldn't Nintendo want the most number of games possible on their brand new console? Of course they would. The only thing that would stop them from wanting that is if they get too many bad games for the console. You don't want the eShop to be 90% garbage, right? So to me, I think the correct solution is neither, right? I don't think they should give dev kits to everybody, and I also don't think that they should restrict dev kits from everybody. I think the answer is solve the problem of having all this garbage on the eShop, right? Remove a lot of it. I think that makes a lot of sense, and have a more strict system in place to make sure that more of it doesn't show up on the Switch 2 eShop, and then you're going to get the best of both worlds. You're going to have the good customer experience of not seeing all the shovelware garbage on there, and you're going to be able to get some of the better indie games, like perhaps Brock the Brawl Bar actually is. I have no idea. This game could be good, it could be bad. It seems like the Steam reviews suggest that it is quite a good game if you like brawler games. Okay, I'm just going off the Steam reviews, but my point is you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater here, right? And I think that Cowcat Games has a great point in the responses here. They say without Steam and other open platforms giving a chance to small indies making Undertale or Shovel Knight years ago, they wouldn't even exist on a closed platform like the Switch 2, and that is also completely true. So the whole situation is very bizarre. Hopefully Nintendo figures out a way to not only improve the backwards compatibility for even more games on the Switch 2, but also finds another way to better combat the slop shovelware garbage on the eShop, because withholding dev kits isn't necessarily the best solution in my opinion. But one thing that is nice to know is that Kiwi Talks does seem to think that 2026 is the year of big third parties on Switch 2. So hopefully that means we have a lot of really cool stuff to look forward to once we cross into the new year. But guys, if you made it to the end of the video, consider dropping a thumbs up, subscribing. I know 95% of you guys are not subscribed, so go ahead and do that. Comment your thoughts. And with that being said, guys, thank you so much for watching. This has been Omniarch. I'll talk to you guys again soon. Peace.